The Juneau World Affairs Council presents George Lakey, author of Viking Economics, How the Scandinavians Got It Right and How We Can Too. Lakey recently retired from Swarthmore College, where he was a professor of issues in social change. He's lived and worked in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. His books have all been about change and how to achieve it.
Hi, very pleased to be here. Wearing, you'll notice, yellow and blue, which means my Swedish persona at the moment. How many of you have some Swedish background? Please raise your hands. Look at all these Swedes. All right. And other days, like tomorrow, I'll be wearing my my Norwegian sweater. How about Norwegians? Do we have some? Oh, yes, we definitely have Norwegians. How about Danes? Are there any? Look at the Danish background here. Whoa, Icelandic? Not so much. Well, you know, Iceland is the smallest of those four nations that I address in my book, Viking Economics. But I had to include Iceland. I couldn't just do it on the basis of number of people, because I had to think also about who is the most Viking of all. And surely the Icelanders claim that credit, because they can read the Eddas and the sagas in the original language. And nobody else that I know of can do that. So we'll give them credit, even though they're not here. They're here in spirit. The way I got into this book writing, this particular book, is because I actually fell in love with a Norwegian long ago when I was a young man. And she was a student in this country, and then after a couple of years of our courtship and getting to know each other and deciding to get married, she left and went back to Norway because she really wanted to get back with her folks and wanted me to come too. And I wanted to because I didn't want to wait until she came back to the US, which I was hoping she would do, because it would take too long. The Fulbright scholarship that she was on required her to stay for a couple of years to avoid brain drain. That was their requirement. Everybody should go back to their own country, and then later on, if they wanted to return, they could. And so I borrowed the money from my grandfather and got on a ship, and 5 days after I got off the ship, we were married. So then began being a stranger in a strange land. For one thing, I wanted to learn the language because I wasn't entirely sure what the priest said when he married us. And I thought it might be useful to know what it was I had agreed to. But also I wanted to get to know the language of the people I'd married into, the family, which didn't speak English, Barrett's family, but also the other folks. I wanted to have my own relationship with them, and I knew that required the language. And then I, of course, started absorbing the culture and had an amazing year, running into all kinds of experiences that I would never, I think, have experienced here. Let me just give you an example. So Barrett had said, since I hadn't finished college yet, I was very young. I was a child groom, really. But anyway, since I hadn't finished college yet, she said, well, why don't you go to the University of Oslo and get some credit there? So I put down, I went to matriculation day in September, and I put down my $14 matriculation fee, and then waited for the other shoe to drop because I was an American. I thought, come on, you know, there's a catch here, or there's something, right? And there wasn't anything else. That was it. So I turned to Sigurd, who was a new Norwegian friend I was making, and I said, Sigurd, how does it make any sense for a country to just underwrite the higher education of its young people? Like, that's a phenomenal thing to do. Like, how does that make any sense? And he said, look, George, wouldn't you say that that brain power is actually a resource, an economic resource for a country? I had to agree that it was. So he said, well then, why would a country want to reduce the impact of a prime economic resource by putting a price tag on it and keeping some people from developing their brains because they didn't have the money? Oh, that's deep. That's way more than I expected. Because to tell you the truth, I had developed a little story about this low-cost higher education thing going on, and I thought the story I'd made up was that Norwegians were idealistic, and idealists are kind of practical and kind of romantic rather than practical, and maybe kind of cute. I thought it was pretty nice, and I was going to benefit from it. That was very nice. I hadn't really thought of it in such pragmatic terms as they had thought about it. They saw it as a way, yes, of advancing equality. It does that. And advancing individual freedom. It does that. But they also expected to get a lot of economic benefit out of free higher education. And not just university, but medical school and law school. And if the medical school places were all taken and you still wanted to go to medical school, then they would send you to Denmark for medical school, or Sweden or the UK or something. And they believed that investing that way in the brain power of their people and the talents of their people would have an economic payoff as well as benefit them in other ways. And since then, now that's a long time ago, that was 1959, I was this youngster who was over there. And since then, of course, we've seen that the Nordic economic model has become the most successful. Decade in and decade out. It's been the most successful, as far as I can tell, in the history of humankind, in terms of delivering equality and delivering individual freedom and delivering shared abundance. So I was very impressed by that. Well, Berit and I did decide to come back after our year in Oslo and take up, not just residence, but take up participation in American society. I was feeling a kind of patriotic destiny. I felt like I belong here. This is my people. She was feeling like, hey, the U.S. is a kind of exciting place. I mean, in Norway, they don't assassinate their prime ministers or anything. So it's all kind of dull. I mean, they put things together. They have things really settled. And so she thought the United States would be a very exciting place. And so we had a rip-roaring 60s together and all of that. But I kept wanting to tell my friends, how about, should we have that mic a little higher? I kept wanting to tell my friends that I was experiencing these amazing things in Norway, and I got to work in Sweden and Denmark. And each time I would come back, I would want to tell my friends, because I'm a storyteller. I like to tell people. And my friends could not be less interested. They would change the subject. And this happened not just 1 year, but multiple years. They would keep changing the subject. And I thought, how could people not be interested in this fascinating thing? And then it hit me. Oh my gosh, this must be American exceptionalism. This is the arrogance that says, we have nothing to learn from other people. Like, why is George trying to tell us about this particular practice? Because if it's a brilliant thing to do, we'd already be doing it. So it's not a brilliant thing to do. So why is George bothering us? All right, so I got very pent up. Can you imagine? Decade after decade, we stayed close to the Norwegian family, and we kept experiencing more and more of their side of life. And then we kept coming back here and getting rebuffed. I got very pent up, I admit it. If I sound awfully excited right now, it's because I'm still pent up. And I'm so excited that you want to hear about this. So what made the difference was 2008. At least that's my experience. 2008 was the time when Americans' arrogance got shaken up, when we realized we didn't have everything all together. And I found that out because I would say things like, very tentatively, ready to back away, but I would say, when the Swedes ran into an economic bubble, a financial bubble, their bankers went wild, and a lot of speculation in real estate, kind of like now, When they ran into that, and then I would pause to see if they wanted to move on to some other subject. And instead, they said, oh, what did the Swedes do? I found out even Barack Obama, not from me, but found out what the Swedes had done, and was very intrigued. In fact, he even said in a news conference in 2008, when he was running for president and was asked, what should we do about this terrible situation where we're trembling close to the cliff of financial future? Barack Obama said, well, the correct thing to do would be what the Swedes did. But we won't do that. Realistic man about power arrangements and what he could get away with, right? So he said, we won't do that. But he knew, that's a policy wonk for you. He knew what the Swedes had done, right? And so when I would start sharing that kind of thing with my friends now, they were very interested and they wanted to know more. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is the time to write a book. And so I fortunately was a professor at Swarthmore College, which was very keen to support me to do the research, because I had more research to do if I was going to actually write a book. After all, it has to have a lot of footnotes in it, right? At least for professors it does. And so I, in interviewing major economists and political scientists over there and historians and ordinary people from various walks of life, I needed to get back and forth, and Swarthmore College supported me to do that. And in 7 years, I got the book out. So I'm telling you that background because we don't always know, why does an author go to the trouble of writing a book? And I did it not just for one more book, but because I really was a pent-up person who so much wanted to share with my people an abundance, a practice that works, that might be useful to us. Now, actually, I have been doing a book tour now for half a year, and there are plenty of Americans who doubt very much that it would work for us. And I feel confident that some of those doubters are in this room at this very moment, right? Because there are some major differences between the US and Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. And you're bound to have some puzzlements about it. In fact, maybe some very strong challenges. So what I would love would be for you to go to this microphone over here and take your turn and challenge me with whatever you want to challenge, because you can tell, pent up George, I'm very eager to sort of spread this gospel about what they're doing over there, and I surely need to be knocked down a peg, don't you think? So that's what I'd like to invite you to do, to go to the microphone and raise questions about what application might this possibly have to the United States of America, which is so different in many ways, even though there are all these Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians who are here in the room. Nobody has gone to the mic yet, so I get to tell you something else while we're waiting for the first questioner. Well, let me tell you about my healthcare experience. That was also another big stranger in a strange land experience, because Barrett said, well, one of the things we have to do now, we're moving to Oslo, we need to get a family physician. And so she looked around and found somebody that she thought was suitable. So we had a family physician. We were disgustingly young, healthy young people, but I was in the habit of getting flu every winter. And so right on schedule, I got flu. And I was really knocked out and thought that I couldn't possibly get to the doctor. So the doctor came to us, and he treated me, and then gave me a little chit and said, this is how much you owe me, and the procedure is you pay me, and then you take this chit and go to the office, and they'll repay you almost everything you paid me, and that's it. Simplicity. Now, the exact procedures change over time. They keep tweaking their system just like any country would. But what struck me as so strange and marvelous about that experience is still comparatively true if we compare their medical system with, say, ours. And that is that there's a wish to avoid bureaucracy and to avoid the complexity of choosing, which medical plan shall I choose, or which insurance scheme, or but instead simply have the family physician, let the family physician prescribe what it is you need, maybe a specialist care, and then you go to a specialist and you just proceed in that way. And the expense is handled by the system as a whole, because it's a universal system. And the money for it comes from taxes. And so it covers everyone, even a foreign student like me, and covers absolutely everyone. And it turns out, now this many years later, I checked again for the book, and I found that that Norway pays 2/3 of what the United States pays for their health care system. Even though the United States pays 1/3 more than they do, we still don't cover all our people. We have tens of millions of people who don't even have health insurance, and additional millions of people who get inadequate care, slip through cracks and so on. Once again, the same experience as the university experience, right? When I think, well, maybe they have this healthcare system because they're idealistic. They think, wouldn't it be nice to have an easy healthcare system for people and totally accessible for everybody? I went to a lecture by their healthcare director at the time when I was there in that first year, and he said that that if a Norwegian who lives above the Arctic Circle, the whole other end of the country from the university hospital where the biggest specialists are, if a person beyond the Arctic Circle gets a brain tumor, then and they need surgery that's available only in the hospital at the other end of the country, then the health service flies them to Oslo so that they can get the surgery they need. Because the point is, you need something, it's the health service's job to make sure that you get it. So that's the nature of the system, and they pay only 2/3 what we pay for our system? That sounds like efficiency to me. So I've thought about that many times since. I thought, well, if you're not paying lots and lots of people to sit at desks denying doctors, denying procedures that doctors want to do, I mean, that's a lot of money right there. You have to pay people a living wage to say no, 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 right? and you don't drive doctors to distraction by all the paperwork that they're expected to do and all the barriers all the hoops that people have to jump through for medical care. All those hoops cost money. So actually what the Norwegians do, and the Swedes and Danes and Icelanders, is they just cut to the chase. Let's make the emphasis the care rather than the bureaucracy. Forget about the waste. Let's just do what needs to be done. It's economically sound. But why is it economically sound? It's also economically sound, not only because they save so much money compared with what we pay for health care, for an inadequate system that we've got, but also because they believe that a healthy workforce is a productive workforce. Makes sense to me. I know I work more effectively. I'm much more productive when I'm healthy. Probably you find the same thing in your own families. And so once again, here's this thing that seems idealistic, and so people might hesitate about it. Well, how could we apply it to here because maybe we're not idealistic enough or whatever. But it turns out it's economically smart to be doing many of the things that are practiced in the Nordic model. I thought, whoa, this is important to share with my friends. Oh, good, someone's coming to the mic. Please let us know. And if you have an ancestor that's Scandinavian, let us know, please.
I don't.
Okay.
I know you talked earlier about how the Scandinavian countries, that it was important that they trusted their government, and that 100 years ago they didn't have that trust in their government. Can you talk a little bit about how that change happened in those countries?
Sure. Did everyone hear the trust thing changed? And that's essential, I think. I mean, 100 years ago, they shouldn't have trusted their countries because my research shows that all those countries, all four of those countries, the decision-making wasn't really in the hands of the people. Those were pretend democracies. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, they all had pretend democracies. That is, they had parliaments And well, 100 years ago, the Danes actually ran Iceland a lot. But the other three, we could just say, those had parliaments and free elections, and it was the economic elite that made the decisions. So that people didn't trust their governments because they shouldn't have. Because the governments weren't serving the people as a whole, they were serving the economic elite. And so what they had to do to make this big change that you're asking about is they had to push the economic elite out of leadership of the economy. Because the economic elite liked running the economy. It was a very good deal for them. Did they care much about the massive poverty that had those countries hemorrhaging people off to the US and Canada and so on? They didn't care because they were sitting pretty. And so they had to be pushed out. They had to be, I think of it as fired. They had to be fired. It was almost as if the people as a whole were saying, look, you've been leading the country now for a few hundred years, and you've been doing a terrible job, so out you go. We'll fire you. So the economic elite was then replaced for leadership of the society by the people as a whole. So democracy became real, not just a pretend democracy, but a real one. Now, what they had to do, though, to push their what is sometimes called the 1%, is that lingo that I can use here too? Yeah, what they had to do to push the 1% out was to be coercive, because the 1% didn't want to leave, didn't take a hint, and in fact called up the troops in order to repress the people's movements and try to enforce their continued rule. So there were decades when there was serious tussle. Now, each country had its own progression. So in the book, I go into more how each country managed itself. But Norway and Sweden were amazingly close in the way or parallel in the way they developed. And so in 1931, things came to a head in Sweden. And that was when the 1% went too far. Their troops committed a massacre, shooting down a whole lot of workers while they were on a nonviolent demonstration. And by the way, all four of those countries waged their struggles nonviolently. That was very interesting too to me. But anyway, that's what happened in Sweden. They mowed people down, and there was a general strike called by the workers, and the government fell, and the transition then just happened because the elite was out, and the farmers and the workers were in with middle-class allies who really cared about the big picture and not just about their personal interests. And so then for over 30 years, the Social Democrats pretty much ran the country, and that was when they invented the Nordic model. Well, something similar happened in Norway. It was a little bit different, but it was struggle through the 20s and the 30s, as in Sweden. It didn't happen in 31, but instead it happened in 36, when the economic elite sat down with the leadership of the farmers and workers and said, okay, we see that you've actually made this country ungovernable by us. Because that's what they'd actually done. They had so many strikes, so many demonstrations, so many nonviolent actions. Even when banks would try to foreclose on farmers, this was Depression time, right? Foreclose on farmers, other farmers would come and then get allies and more to prevent the banks from seizing the farms. So the elite said, hey, look, we get it, that you're not willing to go along and do what we say, and the country can't be governed, and the whole thing is falling apart, so we're out of here. And you can take the direction of the society. And then the Labor Party took the major role in that, but other parties as well, and went on for decades after that, again, collaborating with the Swedes to create the Nordic model. So it was hard work. I certainly don't want to imply that it was a walk in the park, or it was just changing some members of parliament, or having more fancy elections or something like that, because the nature of the struggle was much deeper than that. It was struggle in the streets rather than struggle in the ballot box, because the ballot box was rigged actually in favor of the economic elite. But what really mattered was the struggle in the streets, and that's what delivered the freedom to invent something that no one had invented before. And sometimes when I think, well, this will be a tall order for us, this would be a serious thing for us to commit to changing the leadership of our country, because they'll surely fight back. But I also realize that in a way we have a big advantage over the Nordics at that time, because the Nordics were going where no one had gone before. No one had created the Nordic model, economic model before in history. Nobody I've been able to find created a situation where there was that degree of equality and individual freedom and shared abundance. So nobody could have told them at the time they were creating that, this will work out for you. You can make all these changes and it'll be fine. No, they were taking a chance. They were pioneers. So in a way, although we're going to have our own challenges and our own struggles in making that change here in the US, we do have that much easier than they do. We're not the first. They've gone before. They made a lot of mistakes in the course of their decades and decades of improvisation. We can learn from their mistakes. And also we can adapt what makes sense for us. It's not like there's a blueprint that you just have to take. So we can adapt. But at least we know that the Nordic economic model has worked successful for well over 60 years. Not a flash in the pan, not simply a product of the imagination. It's actually a working model that puts them at the top of the charts. So that might give us the confidence to say, okay, so it's a lot of struggle. We'll go through a lot of struggle. That's all right, because we know there's something on the other side of this that can really make a society that we want to bequeath to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Yes, sir.
I haven't read your book yet, but I will. But I'm curious, do you see any parallel with, in the United States after World War II, well, we had free education for a lot of people, GI Bill. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me like that there was a period, in the 50s when there was a lot of prosperity in the United States. Do you see any parallel with that in Nordic?
I do. It pays. It clearly pays. It was Gunnar Myrdal, the economist who is known in this country for its historic race relations work on our country. It was Gunnar Myrdal who in his PhD dissertation in economics asserted that the classical economists were all wrong in thinking that you don't have to invest in people much because, for one thing, they don't really want to work anyway. Human beings are work averse. They just want to, be lazy and float along, and so they have to be forced to work by having the wolf at the door, to be able to pay the rent and all that. And Myrdal said the classical economists were completely wrong about that. That actually it is human, it is deeply human to want to work, to experience the satisfaction of a job well done. And the the challenge of the economy is to, for one thing, create full employment so everybody can work, and also to design the jobs so everybody can experience the satisfaction of a job well done. Because obviously if you give people jobs that are really terrible, then they're not going to feel the satisfaction of a job well done, right? But if you design the jobs, and any job in principle can be designed in this way, if you design the jobs so that people can experience that satisfaction, they will be delighted and they will work harder and they'll be more productive, and the economy as a whole will grow. And I think the post-World War II parallel is an accurate one. That is, give a lot of people the opportunity to experience a work life that they had never dreamed before they were soldiers that they would get, right? Because they were going to go to college and get a job that they felt would be much more satisfying for them. And then there they were, doing tremendous productivity, and we had a very productive workforce at that time. At this time, worker productivity is higher in Scandinavia than it is here. But at that time, that was a very, very, very highly productive time for our workforce. Also, though, here's the other thing about the difference between then and now. The productivity, the increased productivity that is done by workers in Scandinavia is rewarded by higher wages. Our increased productivity for the last, I'm not sure, 15 years, something like that, has not been rewarded by increased wages. So working class jobs, by and large, have remained flat in terms of wages, even though those workers have become more productive. Do you think that might influence people's zeal to go to work? Oh, I'm going to work even harder now and be even more creative and find even more clever ways of tweaking my job to be. When they read in the paper what their CEOs now earn and know that they're earning the same thing that they earned 15 years ago, the CEO of the Danish firm Novo Nordisk commented on this recently. He said, by the way, CEOs don't earn anything like CEOs in the U.S. The Scandinavian CEOs don't earn anything like that. And this guy was saying, why should I earn so much more than the workers in my firm and then find them becoming less productive because they're alienated by my salary? That's pretty stupid. He didn't say it exactly that way, but pardon my slang. Yes, please.
Since you're a former college professor, I was wondering how you would convince colleges to adopt the system.
How to get to colleges? They can't do it because they're between a rock and a hard place. They have to make their budgets by the end of the year. So it needs to be a governmental undertaking. It's like the healthcare system. There's some things that don't work out when you're just trying to do it piecemeal. That's the fallacy of the market. There are times and places, services and products that really do respond to market stimuli, which is why all four of those countries do keep a market. So it's not, it's not command economy Soviet style. It's not like that. On the other hand, there are some things like education and healthcare where it makes sense. It actually makes economic sense for the government to bring in the money and then disperse it in such a way that either healthcare on the one hand or educational services on the other can be made available to all who are talented enough to use it, or in healthcare, all who need it. So yeah, I don't think it can be a college by college thing. I think it needs to be a governmental responsibility, because that's what makes economic sense, and that's also what makes creates more individual freedom for individuals, and they are so into freedom. They love freedom. Yes.
Well, lots of questions, lots of good thinking. And I've visited a number of those Nordic countries over the years and spent a little bit of time there. I'm just curious, I think what you're saying is we're as strong as our weakest link in some ways. You're a proponent of that with this Viking economics or Nordic economics. And if it makes economic sense, do you have any thoughts on why in the United States in particular we continue to walk by that economic sense? Is it because we focus so much and have historically on the individual as everything versus more of the Nordic collective consciousness of social support and strength as a group first?
It's a great question. I do want to remind you that even when they were poor and their income spread was like that, and they didn't have things handled the way they do now, they still had the same culture pretty much as they have now. So it's not like they are culturally destined to get to the Nordic economic model. So it's much more that up until a certain point, the people didn't have a full sense of agency. They didn't have a full sense of their own power. And also they kept hoping, well, maybe we have a democratic system and we can vote this into being. And so that had to change. They had to see through the democratic pretense and understand, oh, it really is the economic elite that's running our country, even though they don't admit it. That's what's really happening. And number two, they had to develop a sense of their own agency, their own power, that together we can change things. And once they got those two things straight, then they could organize the social movements that made that happen. So I would guess that's what we need to do as well. But there is a third thing that I should add, and that is that they did take the time to develop a vision of what they wanted instead of what they had. So they had massive poverty, for example. They decided, well, what we want is, we want to prevent the poverty, for example. So they did have a vision, something they were really going for. And we, I think collectively, don't have a vision anymore of what we want. I find very few people even talk vision, right? I mean, there are laundry lists. For example, Bernie in his candidacy said, well, let's do this, 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 and this. But by vision, I mean something more substantial than a laundry list. It's a picture of a society that we really want, and that includes the laundry list, but it's more than that. So I'm guessing that when we start talking vision again, what kind of United States of America do we want? And then when we remember that we used to be a can-do people, and we can be again a can-do people, and then I think, and then when we see through the pretend democracy and realize the ballot box is not going to deliver the goods, we're going to have to go to the streets to get this, then I think we will get what we want, because we are many and the obstacle is few. There just are not that many billionaires and super millionaires compared with us. Unless you're all billionaires, and I don't know, maybe you are, I don't know. Yes.
As an immigrant, diverse, multicultural, self-interest kind of nation, do you see that as being an impediment to adopting such a policy?
It is. It does hold us back. It does hold us back, that we have trouble seeing ourselves in the other, and therefore many of us do, and therefore the common good doesn't ring as strongly as the common good used to ring for them. On the other hand, it's very interesting to watch those societies change culturally, because they've been accepting so much immigration. For example, 1 in 5 Norwegians is foreign born. I interviewed at length a man I made friends with from Burundi in Africa to find out what has been your immigrant experience, and found out. I also spent a lot of time interviewing the staff at the Anti-Racism Center in Oslo. And then I compared notes with people in those other countries. And there is a willingness in those countries to invest large resources into settling immigrants and supporting them into the university if they're ready for that, or into other kinds of schooling if they're ready for that, and job training and so on. All of that free, and paying people a living wage. The person I interviewed from Burundi said, oh yeah, this government worker sat down with me and said, I would be paid a living wage for a year to learn Norwegian, learn the culture, learn job skills that I can use in this country, and that I would have to agree to live where the government sent me for that year. And that might be the loneliest year of my life, because they might send me to some remote fishing village in the West Coast where I would be the only black person in the county. And that might be rough, but that's what the government worker said. He said, is it a deal or not? I mean, you can leave, but if you want to stay here, that's the deal we're offering you, and it's a living wage, and we'll help you find a house to stay, and we'll help you at the end of your year, we'll help you find a job that uses your job skills that you picked up. And he said, so I said, yes, obviously, because you're talking to me right now. And I said, well, what was it like? What was that year like? He said, it was the loneliest year of my life. Because at first, well, I didn't have the language, right? And then when I got the language, people still didn't want to talk to me. And I thought, oh, it's because I'm really, really black, and they just are so racist. And then I got to know the culture better, and I thought, well, they don't talk to each other either. So bit by bit, he came to, so it's not that he didn't run into racism, but that bit by bit, he made his own accommodation and understanding of how Norwegians were. And at the end of the year, he sort of graduated, and he, of course, moved back to Oslo so he could hang with African friends. So I said, okay, so what's your life like now? And he said, oh, I found this sweet little church where I play the drums in the church orchestra, and I have a great time. I married an ethnic Norwegian girl. The church is both, people of color and ethnic Norwegians, and we have a baby, and I have a great life, he said. I'm just really grateful to this country. So you could tell from that story, the reason I tell the story is you can tell this represents a big investment in the individual, right? But that is what is totally consistent with the Nordic model, which is we make big investments in our individuals. We do the same thing if they've committed a heinous crime and we send them to prison. We make a big investment in them so that they will not repeat the offense and they will be fine, upstanding taxpayers once again. We make investment in our people, and that's what Gunnar Myrdal said. That's what pays off, and that's what pays off. So in the new society, Sweden, you may not have heard or realized that Sweden took more Syrians and the other folks. You remember that last year, that tremendous flood of Syrians northward and others fleeing Middle East, Iraqis and so on. Sweden took more per capita than any other nation in Europe. So much so they overwhelmed their system. I was describing this elaborate system. They overwhelmed their system. They just couldn't handle it. They had to close the gates, but they hope to open them as soon as they've absorbed this tremendous number they took. So I guess the short answer, the longer answer is actually in the book, because I have a chapter on racism over there. I have a couple of chapters actually that were really interesting to write, called Challenges They Have That We Have, right? Because we have challenges, they have challenges too. And we both have challenges, both sides of the Atlantic have challenges on racism, right? And both sides of the Atlantic have challenges on climate crisis. So I have a chapter on each of those. So that's the more elaborate description of what goes on. But they are working very hard, and the thing that they're doing is using their Nordic economic model as leverage to reduce the racism that the racist pushback that they're getting, because they are getting right-wing pushback. They're getting people talking Nazism and stuff. So it's serious, just as it is serious here. It's not as serious as here, but anyway, it is serious. They're addressing it, and I think you'll be interested in exploring that some more. Yes.
Well, I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders' vision and wondering how in the world could America ever become a social democracy when our economy is so much based on the military-industrial complex in invading and occupying sovereign nations?
What a great question. What a great question. That needs to be considered in our vision of our future. That is, there was that discussion at the end of the 19th century. Do we want an empire? And there was a huge, huge social movement in this country called the Anti-Imperialist League, which fought as hard as it could, nonviolently, fought the idea that the United States should be an empire. But they lost that fight. And the United States did, because the economic elite really, really wanted an empire. The United States got itself an empire. And that means, and you can't keep an empire. I mean, ask the British. Can you keep an empire without a big military? When the British Empire was enormous, it had a big military. When the Roman Empire was enormous, it had a big military, right? So militarism goes with empire. You can't keep an empire without that. So we chose empire. But I would just ask everybody, I wish I could ask everybody, do you really want an empire? Is that really your conception of what America should have? For myself, I don't. I think that empire drags us down as well as makes us enemies of very many people around the world. I think without an empire, we would not have the terrorist threat that we now have. I've said that to the Pentagon, because while I was at Swarthmore, I was teaching a course on nonviolent ways of handling terrorism, and the Pentagon heard about it and invited me to come down and spend time with one of their policy planning units, because they don't have an answer to terrorism. They really don't. So they were just curious. I'm not saying that I have an answer, but I was very interested that they were interested in what I was thinking, and I shared what I was thinking, which was a lot of specifics, and they were so interested and positive about what I was thinking about nonviolent ways of responding to terrorism. It's a big door that's waiting to be opened and experimented with. The problem is, I think one of the problems would be in trying to implement that kind of creative sort of state-of-the-art thinking about struggle and safety. But a big problem about that is, can we do that and be an empire too? And that's where we need some vision work. We just need to ask ourselves, as a nation, do we want an empire? And if the decision is no, we don't actually want an empire, then we'll be free to let go of militarism, and it'll be much easier to have the Nordic model. Can we have the Nordic model as well as the military commitment? Maybe, but much harder, because the military tends to take the priority, right, around budgetary concerns and so on, and it takes so much of our money. So maybe it's possible, but I'm not sure. Being very honest with you. Yes?
So what about scalability economically? You've got really small economies running fairly simply, and ours is extremely complex, especially in terms of the world economy.
Such a great question. Scale, and it's related to the heterogeneity and homogeneity question. Okay, so there I was in one of the research centers in Oslo. The Scandinavians love to do research because they're constantly evaluating, how are we doing, we could do better, we could do better. By the way, Norwegians call themselves a nation of complainers. They would be the last people to tell you they've achieved utopia. They just always have more they want to change, right, and more they want to do. But anyway, there I was in this research center, and to ask a whole lot of interviews of two senior researchers. And on the way in, there was a photograph on the wall that showed what looked like a delegation of Chinese people standing for their photo op with these researchers. And I said, they look Chinese. And the researcher said, yeah, they were. That was a Chinese delegation sent from Beijing by the People's Republic of China. They were economists and policymakers. And I said, they were sent here? Yeah, they were sent here to learn from the Norwegians. I said, what? And they said, that was our reaction exactly. So when we got them into the conference room around the table, we said, why are you here? Because they didn't get it either. And so the Chinese response is one that I'd like you to consider. The Chinese response was, from an economic point of view, there are some features of an economy that are very scalable, up and down. And there are some features of an economy that are not. And we are here, the Chinese said, to look for things that might be scaled up, even to our scale. Now, that was still like, it really threw me. It was kind of stunning to me, because China is so huge, it makes the United States look small. And it's so diverse, it makes the United States look homogeneous by comparison, right? And there they were saying, no, The thing they said about cultural diversity was they said there are features of an economy that are very dependent on cultural homogeneity, and there are things that are not. And so we're just here in the spirit of investigation. We want to find out what you folks are up to. So that gave me a lot to think about. So my next stop was to Iceland. So there I was hanging out with 320,000 people in Iceland, right? And they have a social security system. We have a social security system for 330 million people. That's a difference in scale. Ours works fine, theirs works fine. Medicare gets such high ratings from its customers that, if you could say customers, users, I guess would be the word, right? That people are much, much more satisfied with Medicare than they are with private healthcare plans. Medicare, big scale, but Medicare also used in those countries. So the Chinese may be right. That is, that there are things that can be scaled up. It doesn't matter if you're on Medicare, what your religion is or what your ethnic background is, right? Or whether you can speak great English or not. Medicare is Medicare. Social Security is Social Security. It doesn't actually matter. So there may be a whole lot of features like that. So then I remembered, oh right, New York used to have free university. The most diverse city in the nation at that time. And they used to have free university. Didn't hold them back. So it just opens the mind, I think, to possibilities, along with the possibility that there might be some things that the Nordics are doing that we couldn't do because of cultural difference that would get in the way. And there again, we would just need to look piece by piece if we want to follow the Chinese example and figure out what's usable for us or what needs to be adapted. Wow. No more? Yes. Oh, good.
Hi, good day. Ja, faktisk, I am a full-blown Dane. So
full-blown?
Yes, full-blown. Been in the US for 5 years, so thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate it, and also appreciate that you point out some of the difficulties that the Nordic countries have with immigration, because that is something that they do, especially at the moment. My question to you is, when I talk about the Danish system, I got my undergraduate in Denmark, and not only was it free, I got paid to go to school, which is, for people, really hard to believe, but yes, you get paid a living wage. How would you overcome the thinking? Because I feel like when I talk about my experiences, that it's so foreign, like the idea of giving up the allure of great prosperity, because that is the case. You have a limit of how much wealth you can accumulate in those countries. It's just not part of the expectation that if you work hard, that you will get to great wealth, because the system will take a big chunk of that money that you earn. That's just the way it is. But the expectations are different. So how would you overcome that in a country like the US that is built on this individual freedom and the expectation that you can't work hard? That's the American dream. You work hard, you can get to great wealth. How would you overcome that? What would you I think it's idealistic to think that this could change, but maybe you have a vision for that.
Well, maybe the people who have great wealth would simply resist changing over to the Nordic model. And that's what I would fully expect. Because the people who had great wealth in your country did resist giving, on the other hand, I would also have to acknowledge that there are some billionaires in Scandinavia. So, and to tell you the truth, $1 billion seems like a lot of money to me. So there are people with, actually in Norway anyway, multiple billions. And so some of my favorite parts of the book are dialogues or interviews with people who have substantial wealth, let's say substantial wealth, and questions like, so how do you feel about paying these incredible taxes? And the answer that the interviewer got over and over was, hey, you get what you pay for. We pay a lot because we get a lot, and that really makes sense to us. And so nailing that one down, I think, would matter a lot for Americans, because Americans do have that in our own folk wisdom. My dad told me that when I was 13. He said, George, you get what you pay for. And so the idea of trying to get trying to get services on the cheap, like public education, is really un-American. Look under the surface. It's American to want to pay high taxes to get lots for it. Thank you.
That was George Lakey in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded November 4th, 2016 at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Airlines, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Alaska Power and Telephone, Kerr Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Westman and Associates Incorporated.